Thank you very much. As you've heard, I'm a macroeconomist. And for those of you who don't follow economics, we divide ourselves into these two groups, microeconomists and macroeconomists. Microeconomist is like a microbiologist. The microbiologist studies the smallest organisms. A microeconomist studies the economy at the smallest level, the level of individual consumers, individual firms, individual households. Macroeconomists, on the other hand, study entire economies and how they work as a whole and how individual country economies interact with each other. I want to start out by telling you a story about how I became a macroeconomist. I didn't start out that way. I started out in graduate school wanting to specialize in development economics. And this was because I wanted to help poor people in less developed countries, in countries that are poorer and need additional assistance. As part of my graduate studies, I spent a summer in Lima, Peru, doing research in the Pueblos Jóvenes. The Pueblos Jóvenes of Lima are the favelas of Peru. These are informal communities that arose in the arid mountains that surround the capital, populated mostly by poor migrants from the interior of the country who came there seeking a better life. These communities often lacked basic government services, things like police forces, electricity, water, sewage. They lacked formal employment. And so these people would build their own systems, their own homes, their own businesses in order to survive. Around these Pueblos Jóvenes also arose a group of dedicated aid professionals, people who were trying to help them make these better lives for themselves. And as part of my research, I would go along with the aid workers to homes and businesses and interview people about their situations. This experience profoundly affected me. I was, on the one hand, very impressed by the ingenuity of these people in the informal sector, how they managed to substitute for the missing government services, how they managed to make a living, how they managed to provide themselves with the necessities of life. I was also very impressed with the dedication of the aid workers who were trying to develop systems to help them improve their lot. But what I saw, on the other hand, was also quite shocking. I happened to be in Peru at a time when the country was on the verge of economic collapse and going into hyperinflation. What I saw was that all of the efforts of these micro-entrepreneurs and the aid workers who were supporting them were being overwhelmed by a tidal wave of macroeconomic mismanagement and incompetence. I remember at one point, one of the aid organizations asked me if I would give a little talk to some shoemakers about how to do a better job of their businesses in these challenging times. So I gave what advice I could to them. And then one of the shoemakers explained to me what the real problem was. He said, the problem is we get an order for shoes, we go out and we buy the raw materials, we make the shoes, and we deliver them. And by the time we deliver the shoes, the amount that we get paid for them has become so devalued because of the hyperinflation that we can't even take that money out and buy the next set of raw materials. They were in a downward spiral that was being caused by the hyperinflation of the economy. I didn't have a solution for this problem. What could I tell them? It wasn't a problem that they could fix. It was a macroeconomic problem, and it required a macroeconomic solution. That's when I decided to become a macroeconomist. And I've spent the last 26 years working in crisis economies around the world, from Ecuador and Paraguay to Pakistan and Romania, as well as giving advice in more prosperous places like the EU, where I currently work. Over the past few decades, the world has become an increasingly interconnected place. This is true in economics, but it's also true in science, information, the environment. In many aspects, we have become more connected as a world than ever before. Just to illustrate a few points. International tourism, as measured by international travel, has gone up by 2.3 times just since 1995 to 1.2 billion international trips a year. Think about that, 1.2 billion international trips a year. International trade has grown by even more, by 3.4 times, from 5 trillion of exports in US dollars to $17 trillion of exports per year. Our interconnectedness as measured by access to global information has grown by even more. Access to the internet has gone from just 0.4% of the population in 1995 up 260-fold to 54% of the world population having access to the internet in 2017. This is mostly a very good thing. The increased pace of interconnectedness, which we call globalization, has provided countries and its citizens with access to cheap raw materials, to consumer goods they never dreamed possible before, has caused the sharing of culture and norms and values across the world. It has allowed for technological progress and unprecedented economic growth. Indeed, in the post-World War II era, globalization and technological change have fueled an unprecedented improvement in world living standards. Let me just illustrate this with a couple of examples. This chart, where each country is a bubble, and the bubbles are sized according to the population, shows life expectancies in 1950 and income levels in 1950. And what you can see is that a large segment of the population had a life expectancy of between 30 and 40 years. That's pretty pathetic compared to some of the most prosperous countries that had life expectancies in the 70s. Let's see what's happened in the post-war period since 1950. We see that as income levels have grown, life expectancies have soared, particularly in some of the poorer, the countries that started in the worst position in the world, China and India being those two largest bubbles there. And you can see how there's been a dramatic improvement in both income levels and life expectancies over this period of time. This is also being reflected in a dramatic reduction in poverty. In 1950, 56% of the world's population was classified under the World Bank definition as being in extreme poverty. 56% of the world in extreme poverty. Here, each color represents a continent, Asia being the largest one, particularly representing India and China. Look what's happened to extreme poverty over the last 70 years. We see a gradual movement along the scale, and all of a sudden, starting in the 1980s and 1990s, an incredible move of this lump of people out of extreme poverty as India and China began their economic rise. This is an enormous achievement that's been brought about by globalization and by technological change, by the enormous growth that we've seen and the increased interconnectedness of our economies and our lives. But of course, you will say, there have been a lot of problems. We have a lot of international problems. It's not just all good news. And that is very true. Let me just start out with a couple of examples of this. Since 1995, carbon emissions have increased by 50%, from 6 billion metric tons to over 9.8 billion metric tons. Over the same period of time, the number of refugees in the world has also increased by 1.5 times, as measured by the UN High Commission for Refugees, to 23 million. So there are also problems, international problems that are growing in the world. French President Emmanuel Macron, a year ago in a speech at the Sorbonne, said the following: "There are many challenges, from climate change to digital transition, migration and terrorism, global issues, which an inward-facing country can only hope to offer limited responses." Indeed, I think it is fair to say that virtually every major problem facing the world today is either global in nature or has at least a significant international component to it. Let's think about those. Climate change, obviously. International migration and refugees. International peace and stability. Global financial stability. Remember the last recession, where problems in one part of the world propagated themselves into a worldwide recession. Cybersecurity, income inequality, and many more. None of these challenges, I would argue, can be solved locally by one country or by one region. Problems at a global level require international cooperation and global governance. Without such cooperation, we cannot hope to fully deal with these problems, even if every individual country wanted to. Why is this the case? Because of what we economists call externalities. If one country does something wrong, has a bad policy, they underestimate the bad effects of the policy that it has on other countries, not just their own. Likewise, with good policies, countries underestimate the benefits of good policies because they don't count fully the good spillover effects that those good policies have on the rest of the world. So as a result, we have too many bad policies and not enough good policies because we're not taking into account the full effects. We often hear the mantra, and we heard it this morning, think globally, act locally. And many of us try to behave accordingly. We care about the environment, so many people, like me, put solar panels on the roofs of our houses, or we drive an electric car. We sort our trash, and we recycle the bottles and the cans and the papers. We are concerned about poverty, so we volunteer at the local soup kitchen or donate toys at Christmas time to less fortunate people. We care about refugees, so we maybe volunteer at the local refugee shelter. These are all noble, important, and necessary actions. So don't get me wrong. I don't want you to stop doing those things. But they are not sufficient. Remember the Peruvian shoemaker and the aid workers. All those micro-level good actions can be overwhelmed in a tidal wave of bad management at the global level. If there is no international control on carbon emissions, the solar panels on my house are going to make virtually no difference in a wave of carbon emissions from elsewhere. If we don't properly price gas and oil, taking fully into account the negative externalities the burning of those fossil fuels has on human health and on the environment, my Tesla will just become an expensive status symbol. It will have no impact on the overall state of our environment. If the government closes its door to refugees and fails to address the root causes of the refugee flows in the source countries, then my volunteer work at the local shelter will have little overall impact. So in order to get these big things right, at least some of us have to not just act locally, but also act globally. For some of you, that might mean contemplating a career at the UN or the IMF or working for the EU. For others, it may be becoming a climate scientist or international public health experts. For many of the rest of us, it may mean simply voting, donating, and volunteering, not just to local causes, but also to global causes, causes with a global focus. It would certainly mean for all of us that we need to have a change of mindset from being just an American or just a Swiss or just a Nigerian to also being a global citizen. We can't just be a Christian or a Muslim or a Sikh. We have to also be people who are concerned about the welfare of humanity as a whole. We live in a world where the forces of nationalism and tribalism are on the rise. These populists tell us to narrow our focus. Don't care about the Syrian or the Central American refugee, not your problem. Who cares about the collapse of the Greek economy or the Argentine economy? Not your concern. Problems come from abroad. They come from the foreigner. They come from the other. They come from outside. So close the borders, build the wall, exit, hunker down. That attitude is profoundly misguided. It is certainly true that in our interconnected world, difficulties from one part of the world can certainly be propagated into other parts of the world, into other regions, into other areas. But isolation is not the answer. In fact, isolationism will often make the problem worse. During World War II, a very foresighted group of governments and individuals got together And they saw that many of the roots of that cataclysm came from the isolationism, protectionism, and the barriers built in the interwar years. The beggar thy neighbor economic policies and the tariff barriers, combined with a withdrawal from world affairs by important major powers, directly contributed to the Great Depression and to World War II. These individuals and governments resolved to make the post-World War II era different, in part through the creation of a network of international organizations: the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, joined older siblings like the International Labor Organization. NATO provided the West with a common defense. The International Atomic Energy Agency and organizations like Intelsat oversaw the dissemination and control of key technologies. European countries joined together, first just 6, and only covering coal and steel, and gradually widening to 28 countries, cooperating in areas like energy, transportation, medical standards, and even a common currency. This network of international cooperation has often been cumbersome and inefficient, but it has played a vital role in that unprecedented success economically and in terms of living standards that I showed you a few minutes ago. But today, I believe we need another generation to step forward to the challenge of international cooperation for the problems of today. Global warming, the unprecedented floods of refugees, economic inequality, demographic imbalances. This new generation needs to reform the system, to improve efficiency, accountability, and to take into consideration those who have been left behind in the decades of globalization. Just 3 weeks ago, in the Paris Peace Forum, German Chancellor Angela Merkel made the following observation: the answer to World War II was to create a legal order and a framework for international cooperation. I often wonder if, today, we were again called on as an international community to adopt such a declaration of human rights. Would we be up to the task? I fear not. Well, with the rising tide of nationalism and populism, Merkel's doubts are understandable. But there is also hope. Most people today still believe that cooperating is the best solution to our common problems. A recent survey among a number of countries around the world, including countries where populism is on the rise, found that 83% of the population believes that we should cooperate among countries to deal with our shared problems. So my message to you and my note to myself is, let's be the generation that renews international cooperation to confront our problems that we share in common. Don't retreat behind walls and borders. And don't just act locally, but act globally for a better world. Thank you.